It may have become much easier to raise taxes for civic projects thanks to a new ruling from the California Supreme Court. In addition to discrimination lawsuits, the Salk Institute faces funding and competition problems. San Diego Unified Superintendent starts a new year with the same big problems, and schools are doing away with remedial and other math classes so more students can graduate. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Scott Lewis, Editor-in-Chief of Voice of San Diego. Hi, Scott.
Hey, Mark.
Good to have you back today. Gary Robbins, Science and Technology Reporter for San Diego Union-Tribune. Hi, Gary.
Hello, Mark.
And KPBS Education Reporter Megan Burks. Hi, Megan.
Hi, Mark.
Glad you're here with us today. Well, the requirement that 2/3 of voters must approve tax increases to pay for new stadiums or convention center expansions may have been scuttled by the California Supreme Court. The ruling this week on Proposition 218, passed by California voters in 1996, could have profound impacts on high-profile projects here and across the state. Or not. It's a bit unclear at this point. So, Scott, tell us, what did the majority say? What they say about how tax increases proposed by local governments and those by citizen groups? What's the ruling on that?
Yeah, well, there was a marijuana collective in the city of Upland that was challenging the city's decision that what they wanted to do was pass a tax. And they said, no, this isn't a tax. And so they appealed and went first to the main court, obviously, onto the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal said, this is, we don't have to decide that because the law is that is silent on what you're doing. It's silent on a citizens' initiative tax, which had huge implications because that would mean that it was silent in all of its parts, including the part that says that if you do a special tax via citizens' initiative, then you would need 2/3 of the vote. So right now, if you want to pass a tax on any local level, you need, if you're just going to give the money to the government for no reason, you just need a 50% of the vote. But if you're going to give the money for a specific purpose, for schools or for a stadium, you need 2/3 of the vote. And so what this says is that if citizens' initiatives don't have to comply to that part of the Constitution, if it's silent on citizens' initiatives, then that means citizens' initiatives can raise taxes at just a simple majority. There have been several tax increases over the last decade or so that have fallen, even though they got more than 50% of the vote. There was a big tax increase for fire protection that would have created a county fire department after the 2007 fires. And everybody says, oh, they're anti-tax, they didn't vote for it. Well, 65% of people voted for that.
So it almost got there.
But it didn't get 66% of the vote.
Right.
Those kinds of things would be much easier to do, except it would be weird. It wouldn't be the government putting up the tax. It would be special interests, so transit advocates or school advocates or teachers' unions or whatever could get together and put a citizens' initiative up and perhaps get it at simple majority.
Well, and the people who, the anti-tax folks here say there's a lot of mischief there because we can wink and nod and some city government folks can simply quietly back a citizens' initiative and all.
Well, it's important to remember that everywhere else in the country is like this. You can raise special taxes. You know, when Arlington, Texas built the big stadium there, they did it with hotel room taxes, and they got a simple majority vote to pass it. This would be kind of strange, though. Like the mayor wanted to do a convention center expansion, remember, and use some of the money for homeless and streets. Mm-hmm. Well, that would have taken 2/3 of the vote. He was thwarted, and maybe lucky now because the hotels and everybody can get together and put together an initiative that would only perhaps need 50% of the vote. Now, everybody's still reading every word of this ruling to see if it truly does have those vast implications. And I think over the next couple of weeks, we'll start to see if people trust it enough to actually try to test it.
Right. Now, I do have a bite here. Taxpayer groups, as we said, are concerned here. I got John Kupel of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. Let's see what he has to say. Oh, I'm sorry. We don't have a bite. I have to read this. I think there's any way that we can sugarcoat this. It's a significant decision that will lead to unbridled collusion between local governments and special interest groups. That's what those folks are saying. So they're talking about this mischief.
Right. Well, Howard Jarvis was the group that put up that requirement. And you might think it's odd to have, if you're going to tell people where you're going to spend the money, you would think that would be and more compliant. You should be able to pass that tax easier if you're going to guarantee where that money goes. Well, they actually made that at 2/3 precisely because they knew that would be easier. They wanted to make it as hard as possible to pass a tax. And so now they're promising to go back to the voters or go to the legislature and try to get this fixed somehow.
So, Megan?
Well, I think that there's definitely reason to be concerned and skeptical, but if you look at school funding, I mean, with Prop 13, it's been really hard to pass new measures to benefit schools, and so we've seen this move toward bonds where you do have to lay out, you have to say, I'm going to build this great, awesome stadium, I'm going to do this, and we've seen the result of that, which is that it's not sexy to install pipes. So exactly. Schools are kind of losing out on basic operations.
Right, 2010, San Diego Unified School District tried to pass a parcel tax, got 50.8% of the votes. So just enough for a majority, but not enough for 2/3. So yeah, you could ostensibly picture teachers or somebody getting together to do this. But you're right, construction bonds are the only group that you can get at 55% of the vote. But you still need 55, not 50.
A few seconds left in this segment. Is it likely legal challenges may change this whole thing? Is this pretty
I think
tentative?
what's most likely is somebody will try to do it and be challenged.
Okay.
And we'll see for sure if it's clear. If it's as clear as we think it is.
So the courts may have another crack at this apple as we go along.
Absolutely.
Fascinating, though, if it stands. I mean, it changes the game entirely. All right, we're going to move on. The turmoil continues at La Jolla's Salk Institute. It began when news that 3 female scientists had filed lawsuits for gender discrimination. And as we told you earlier, they didn't do it lightly or easily. Here's a clip we aired several weeks ago of renowned Salk scientists Vicki Lundblad and Catherine Jones explaining.
It really came down to I was just keeping quiet about stuff I just felt was so wrong, and I'd sort of lost respect for myself. That's what I meant when I said I just couldn't not do this at a certain point. That was the tipping point.
I thought, really, am I going to step away from my science, which is at the peak of almost there on an incredible story, in order to fight this? And I thought, I have to. And I thought to myself, my first thought was, you're going to get scooped and you're going to lose this whole thing. And I thought, and if I don't, I'm going to be made extinct.
Well, after initially disparaging the women and their work, Salk President Elizabeth Blackburn, a Nobel laureate, dialed it back recently just before a major fundraiser. Then came news this week that the Salk has lost its board president while facing steep challenges to raise enough money to compete with other institutions seeking cures for deadly diseases. So, Gary, the overall impression had been that Salk was just sailing along and doing well financially, but you got some documents this week that tell a different tale.
The Salk is putting out conflicting information. So they had a big fundraising campaign. It went very well. They raised $360 million. That ended in 2015, but within a year, they were privately asking themselves, could we quickly raise $100 million in an endowment? They were asking very provocative questions like, should we sell our name or alter our name for a lot of money, like $1 billion? If someone came to us and said, we'll give you $1 billion and make it the Salk Mark Institute, would we do that? Mm-hmm. So they began looking at all of these things, and what becomes apparent as you look at these documents is they're very concerned about their financial future. Mm-hmm. Not talking way down the road, we're talking about right now, because they're doing poorly in raising money from the National Institutes of Health while others are not. So there's problems in the management and the raising of money, and I think it has a lot to do with who they are as an institute. They want to stay small, and they want to remain focused on basic research, but they're being pressured, like other institutes, to take those basic discoveries and take them further along, so pharma companies and donors and government
them to the market.
Will get them to the market, and they're just not of that mind.
Do they have a big endowment, like a pool that they can rely on year to year? Or
some of the they have an endowment. I don't know exactly how large it is. One of the documents says that they are roughly even with some, behind others, ahead of others. So it varies, but it's not a huge endowment. They didn't work on that kind of thing for a long time. I think they were hopeful that people like Ted Waite, who had been chairman, a billionaire, would stay and work on it. But he's leaving as chairman after only roughly a year in that position. So they need management people, and they need a better idea of how they're going to raise money going over the next 5-10 years.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of mysterious why Ted Waite is leaving.
It is. He had stepped down from 2 other nonprofit boards like at roughly the same time, and he said it was for personal reasons. Didn't make clear why. That's his prerogative, obviously, to do that. But I think one of the issues that we're seeing here is that the Salk is not being very transparent. They won't sit down and answer questions face to face. And a lot of their money comes from the public. So, there's a real issue there. And so we're hoping that they loosen up some.
So what are they saying for the record? I mean, what's their kind of public posture on this?
Well, they're saying that their financial condition is good. One of their statements said that they had a operating surplus of about $1 million averaged over 3 years. That is not a lot of money. And one of their documents said, in fact, that they had a deficit of more than $3 million in one of those years. The problem here is that what they do is very expensive. A piece of equipment can cost close to $1 million, and different scientific disciplines change very quickly. There's a lot of money flowing into immunotherapy. If you're not positioned to do that, to get the right people and to get the right equipment, you can be left behind, and that hurts your bottom line.
So, you've talked a lot about finances, but there was obviously this gender discrimination issue that came up as well. Is that tied together, or is that just a separate drama altogether?
Well, a lot of it, Scott, it all comes back to money. These female professors are saying, look, you weren't paying us at the same level. You weren't giving us access to the same grants. You weren't giving us the same level of promotions or leadership opportunities. In one way or another, that all ties back to money.
It also all ties back to leadership. I mean, you have to wonder if something gets to the point of going to the courts, well, what wasn't happening before?
And I think people are going to look more closely at Blackburn now. The way that she ridiculed those two professors, she got a lot of blowback nationally from other scientists saying, it's not necessary to go there. Let's focus on the problem. And in one of the documents, there was a single sentence that asked the question as to whether she personally had the ability to bring in the kind of money that the Institute feels that it needs. That's a management issue. So there are management issues and money issues all tied together, and they affect everything from employment and diversity to what they actually study.
And a lot of competition among these research institutions for the same kind of money and the same pools from the government grants and private funders and rich folks.
Go across the street to Sanford Burnham, to TSRI. They're in the same fight. Now, and Sanford Burnham's chief executive recently stepped down. He did, that's after 3 years after arriving. Sanford Burnham owns a facility in Florida, and they're having tremendous financial problems with that. They've been trying to get rid of it. So that really wears and tears on executives and on institutions. They've raised a lot of money in many areas, but money is a constant.
And with the cutbacks in Washington, and who knows, with this hurricane funding and the disaster down in the Houston region now, what institutes of health and other agencies that provide funding and grants for these?
It is always uncertain, but one of the problems here is that the institutes generally here and in other parts of the country don't really talk in a clear, frank way with the public. They keep saying, well, it's harder than ever to get NIH money. But if you really look closely, on balance, NIH money has gone up. There was a historic jump in a lot of it, then it leveled out, and then they're talking about this year that it's going to go up. That's what they're hoping that it will do. So, in fact, these institutes have gotten tremendous amounts of money. Some are better than others at competing for it, and that gets lost a lot of the time. If you're having problems with your faculty at a place like Salk, that can mean that you have a problem competing, and those private documents just said right out straight that Salk hadn't done enough to hire mid-career professors who had a really good track record of bringing in a lot of money. They had a lot of people who were younger, a lot of people who were older, but they weren't doing the kind of job that they need to have those people in the middle.
All right, well, we've got to move on, but we'll certainly watch that story as we go and see what happens at the Salk with changes to come, apparently. Well, they've got more money and fewer students to educate than just a few years ago, yet the San Diego Unified School District begins the year with myriad problems, many of them financial, most of them familiar. And Scott, you sat down and listed some of these obvious problems here, kind of an exhausting exercise. Yeah. Give us the high points, the bullet points on that list.
Well, that one was a really interesting one. So their enrollment has gone down over the last several years, and yet the money has gone up, and there wasn't a corresponding change in the classroom ratio. And so I would check on it this year and to see how that trend was going, because there have been some changes personnel-wise. But they literally can't tell us how many employees they have. We've been asking for now 5 months to get the information, or 4 months, I guess, to get the information about how many employees they have.
Pretty basic question.
They can't tell us, yeah. So that, along with, they've invested a tremendous amount of money in facilities, and yet the facilities index has gone down as far as the stability and quality of the facilities They have, there's a lot of promises about investing in buildings, and instead a lot of that money went to fund stadiums and stuff like that. There was a school where they found lead in the pipes, and they had used that school and that plumbing at that school to sell 3 separate bonds and tax increases and such that would go into construction bonds, and never addressed the piping in that school, and yet had built a new field for that school. There's a lot of these sorts of things. We've been following the graduation rate. They're very proud of the graduation rate. But what we also discovered that they had encouraged hundreds of the struggling high school students to go to charter schools to get out of that graduation rate calculation. And when they denied that, they even put up a webpage saying that we were full of it, we didn't know what we were talking about. And yet, just last week or 2 weeks ago, acknowledged that yes, indeed, that had been happening, that they had been encouraging students who were struggling to leave traditional district schools for charter managed schools. And over again, these kinds of things have just piled up, and I sat down to list it all. This year, Scripps Ranch High School doesn't have a principal. The custodial staff has been completely wiped out. I hear complaints about techs not being able to work on computers. Obviously, these big organizations have tremendous problems all the time. But some of the systemic issues there have been quite dismaying.
Well, and upsetting is the lack of transparency and all. That you've run into that too, haven't you, Megan? On your education beat.
I checked before coming down here. I have a public records request in that I put in January. I'm now on 32 weeks, so if I were pregnant, I'd be going into the 3rd trimester.
You can have a baby before you can get a record out of the school district.
What do they tell you when you ask, why can't you tell us the number of your employees? How is that possible?
They'll say that they've lost key personnel. And that's what's interesting. They've lost key HR, budgeting personnel. The CFO left last year. They'll say that the people in charge of these sorts of processing of these questions have been decimated. It always goes back to the people who can answer, you can't be here right now or can't answer that question. It's we tracked actually the number of days that it takes to get back on some of these public records requests, and it actually corresponds to about March of 2015 or so when it just started soaring, and that's when we I don't know exactly what happened at that point, but the time to get some of these requests back has
I
just
spoke with a citizen group that they want to potentially pursue litigation for the school district against this anti-Islamophobia plan that it put out, and whether or not they pursue it is all contingent on whether they can get a records request, and they're in line behind me. So the last I spoke to them a couple weeks ago, they hadn't gotten it, and this could be the deciding factor for whether or not they need to deploy some legal resources.
We sued and won our lawsuit against them because of they were illegally withholding correspondence about a topic, and we're still working out the settlement terms on that. But yeah, without a team of lawyers, getting a public records request fulfilled from them is hardly a guaranteed proposition.
If they cannot tell you something as basic as how many people they have, can they reliably tell you how well their students are doing?
Well, that's what's been frustrating for us. Is we really sincerely wanted to understand how they pulled off this graduation rate that they were so proud of. It was far higher than even academics who had studied the situation thought it would be because of some of the more stringent requirements they put in. And we ran into so many roadblocks that it just became more and more dismaying as we peeled that onion. Now, they did form a commission to evaluate those stories that we uncovered, and hopefully that report will come back and have some insights about what's really going on. But yes, it throws into doubt all the information.
When Mario Coran finally got the records he needed to confirm what he was reporting anecdotally, it was like suddenly the bunker had opened and we could talk about some legitimate reasons.
Yes.
Sometimes these charter schools are the right choice for students, but instead we spent months and months in denial and really just frustrating people.
And this is at the heart of what I was complaining about, is that there's this just this fear of vulnerability, that they're unwilling to admit that anything is wrong. and unwilling to just use that as a way to rally people to help solve some of these problems. I mean, obviously there are going to be struggles for such a giant, important urban district like that, but there's an immunity of fear of showing any kind of vulnerability about these. And so it's always this argument about, well, we're perfect, everything's been fine, and then until somehow you can make that tipping point where it's okay to admit.
Or it's about the kids. So with the AP test score fiasco at Scripps Ranch, you know, people in the media felt like they were lied to because they were told there was no cheating incident, and then suddenly they found out that there was one. And, you know, we wasted a full week when the district could have come out and said, okay, there was one cheating incident, but let's not, you know, devolve into bullying this kid. Let's, you know, the district could have leaned into it and sent a positive message.
Well, we're going to keep a close eye on your reporting as we go forward here, and you know, it's a basic fundamental thing we do, which is hold public officials accountable. I do want to shift gears now, another back to school story, and this is at the college level. And Megan, you reported this week on how remedial math has become a huge obstacle to staying in college and getting a degree. Explain that problem.
Yeah, so for a long time, when you get into a community college or CSU, you take a placement test, and these placement tests are reported or are just continually kind of misplacing students, and so a lot of times students will land, you know, 2 or 3 layers below having to make up high school math before they can ever get into a college level math class. And for a lot of students, you know, maybe people who are going to community college didn't always love school, trying it out. If you realize you're going to have to take 2 years to get up to a college level, just drop out.
That's the end of it for them.
Yeah, a lot of kids just really tread water, you know, get stuck in these classes and just don't have a chance to earn a degree, even if they're not going into a STEM field.
So your story focused on Cuyamaca College. What changes were made to address this problem?
So they were kind of a front runner locally in getting rid of what they call this math pipeline of doom, getting rid of those lower levels and just putting students either straight into that first level of remediation and accelerating it, or putting them straight into college math and just giving them a better learning experience, working remediation in, but letting them make progress toward a degree.
Okay. And there are some parents and academics alarmed about this problem here, and we have a clip from your story, Erica Heinzman, professor of education studies at UC San Diego, talking about the alarm that she sees.
You see headlines that say, do away with intermediate algebra, the end of intermediate algebra, but there is still going to be requirements that students have quantitative reasoning in order to get degrees. So that's not ending. What is exciting is we're opening up the conversation to say, what does that look like?
Okay, and you were explaining part of what that looks like. Now, these changes at Cuyamaca, how would they help students?
They have stunning results just for the first year. So before making these changes, about just 10% of students who came in those lower level classes would ever actually get a math course completed that counted toward their degree. Just with this change, it's now 67%. So from 10 to 67%.
Okay, and it's early yet, but it looks pretty promising.
Yeah, and there are state universities in other states that have made similar changes, and they're all seeing maybe not as stunning changes, but they've deemed it successful.
Gary?
Is there any sense of how it's affecting a school like Cal State San Marcos, which takes some students from there? San Marcos is growing really fast, and a lot of their growth is in the sciences and mathematics, computer sciences. Do they have a sense of what it'll mean for?
And this is going to segue beautifully into a clip we have. Go ahead, Megan.
So their CSU San Marcos and all CSUs now are making similar changes. The Board of Trustees put out an order this summer to have them rework their classes, get rid of this math pipeline, and accelerate remediation, if not forgo it altogether. So they'll be doing the same thing. They're being very careful to make sure that there are options that support students who want to go into the STEM fields still. So there's a lot of discussion in the math world about this right now.
Well, let's play this clip then. It's Kamel Haddad, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Vice Provost at Cal State San Marcos, and saying people think math is dumbed down. That's not the case, he says.
Somebody who is interested to start a STEM field, and therefore who's interested in taking a calculus course, who comes deficient in Algebra 2 content, we would have to be able to remedy that student in lesser time than we ordinarily have in the past. That will definitely, we're not going to do that by lowering the level of the calculus class, for example.
All right, a few seconds left. How are students reacting to all these changes?
They're excited. I spoke to several students who had gotten through the class at Cuyamaca, and they said if they didn't have that class, they would have dropped out.
And you were going to comment on the bite thing?
Yeah, you know, I think that they still want to provide this ability for students to get into STEM fields, but it's about looking at the pedagogy and making the class better, going from a lecture to a class that's more collaborative and better for the student.
And keeping kids in school. If they're not there, obviously they can't learn, they can't get a degree, they can't move on. So very interesting development. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Scott Lewis of Voice of San Diego, Gary Robbins of the San Diego Union Tribune, and Megan Burks of KPBS News. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. Wherever you get your podcasts, you can look us up there. And before ending today, I want to tell my old friends and all the folks in the Houston region that our thoughts and best wishes are with you at this perilous time. I lived through and covered a couple of tropical storms as a reporter for the Old Houston Post in the late 70s, saw firsthand the devastation that can bring, and though nothing on the scale of Hurricane Harvey, life there will never be the same after this. But life goes on in our era of climate change. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.